I have asked tonight our Minister to Youth and Liturgical Arts, Reverend Crystal Newby Reynolds, if she would teach for us, as this is a developmental process for her engaging with the congregation. So Reverend Crystal is prepared to teach for us tonight, and we will give our attention to her. If you have not downloaded the outline, you can go to the website and do so, but it will also be put up on the screen as we go through our Bible study. All right, Reverend Crystal, thank you so much. Let's pin you, and you can go.
All right. Thank you, Pastor, for having this opportunity again. And good evening, everyone. I hope you're well, safe, and healthy, and just mainly safe at this point. It's always an honor when Pastor allows me to come before you and share some research, knowledge, and love of being a student of the Bible with you, things that I have found and I'm learning as I'm growing in the Word and walking along with you. Tonight, we're going to talk about the book of Joshua. I hope that you all were able to download the outline. I'm going to use a presentation. This is all learning technology, so bear with me, as some things may work, some things may not, but I'm hoping that I have some favor tonight and everything will work well. So again, we're going to talk about the book of Joshua, which all of you may be familiar with. Joshua is the fifth book, or the book after the Pentateuch. It is named basically after the main character, who is Joshua. There's some ringing. I don't know if you guys hear this ringing. Is it because I'm hosting that I hear all this ringing? Is that people entering?
Yeah, if you go to participants and you click on more, you'll see the option to remove the chime as people enter and exit.
More, is it, where would I see that? I see the
Participant.
more. Okay, more at the bottom, more. Okay. What do I do? What do I hit?
You click, after you click more, you'll see where it says play, enter, / exit chime.
I got it, I see it. Okay. It's still chiming, but like, okay, I don't know.
Did you uncheck it?
I tried to. Let's see if it worked. Okay, it worked now. I'm sorry about that. It's like this ringing. I'm like, okay, is my doorbell ringing? Something's ringing and it keeps ringing. I guess that's every time somebody enters or exits for that, I don't know. At any rate, so we're talking about Joshua. The book of Joshua is loaded. I'm gonna begin to share my screen now. Let's see. All right, are we seeing that? Can you see that? Are you sharing?
Can see it.
Okay, very good. So the book of Joshua, again, is the first book after the Pentateuch. It is filled with loaded information about God's people. The name Joshua means the Lord is salvation, and it continues the story of salvation that began with the Exodus from Egypt and ends with the taking of the land of Canaan, at which point the Israelites evolve into a nation of Israel. As a group, the first 5 books of the Bible are known as the Mosaic teaching, or the Torah, in the Hebrew Bible. The next section is designated as prophecy, not because of visions, but because of the describing of the future from the Torah, how it's illustrated in everyday life. So the prophetic books are divided into 2 main segments: the former prophets and then the latter prophets. So Joshua is the first book of the former prophets, and that's what we'll be looking at today. I tried to give you as much information as I can digest, and now I'm going to spit it out. So the writing is about around 1300 BC and 1050 BC. The author is possibly Joshua or Samuel, because of course Joshua couldn't write his own death But there some scholars believe that Joshua was the author, and then some parts they believe were written by Samuel. The key text we find in chapter 21, which is verse 44 and 45. The Lord gave them rest on every side, according to all he had sworn to their fathers. None of their enemies were able to stand against them, for the Lord handed over all enemies to them. None of the promises the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. Everything was fulfilled. So if we were to take one scripture from the book of Joshua, that would be the main scripture that we could remember about that book, is how God had promised through Moses this land, and Joshua went in and took it. So in a one sentence summary, under the leadership of Joshua, God fulfilled all his promises to Israel through the conquest of Canaan and the allocation of the land among the tribes. The audience for this book is, they think, is probably the Israelites living in their own land before kingship had taken over. Because remember, at this time, there were no kings. It was God that ruled everything at this time. There's no indication of a specific event or what prompted the writing of this book. However, if Joshua was written by Joshua, scholars believe that he was following the tradition of Moses, and what he was doing was writing down the mighty acts that God had accomplished through his leadership. If the author was not Joshua and perhaps Samuel or someone else, then the need would be to give Israel a permanent account for its history or early days of triumph in the land before the establishment of kingship. So the purpose in Genesis, we found that God had made a covenant with Abraham and included a promise to his descendants. They would take possession of Canaan. For many years, the agreement was unfulfilled. The book shows how God in Joshua's time fulfills the promise. I'm fighting with allergies, so forgive my voice. So as we move on. So the book structure, there's 24 chapters in this book, and it documents the conquest and settlement of the land of the Canaan. It's divided into 4 main parts, and we'll go through each one throughout this study. The first one is the going over from chapters 1 to 5. Then there's the taking from chapters 6 to 12. And then there's the dividing of the land from 13 to 21. And then there's the worshiping in 21 to 24. Joshua fits in God's story. I always look at this format of how God's story is put together. Joshua fits in where God builds his nation. If we go down and we look for the Christ in Joshua, we find that his name is a variation of Jesus, and Joshua means Yahweh is salvation. Joshua's leadership over God's people and taking over the promised land foreshadows Christ is leading people to God, it should say, into eternal inheritance. Joshua was one of the only biblical heroes in the Old Testament that were presented as flawless and sinless. And we know this about Jesus, as the commander of the Lord's army. Let me go back. As commander of the Lord's army, Joshua foreshadowed Christ. He was a pre-incarnate of Christ. So they compared Joshua to Christ. Joshua is the Christ of the Old Testament, for lack of better words. If we look at it from a Christian worldview, when I think of Christian worldviews, I look at the way Christians look at religion. When we're teaching about God, it shows God's faithfulness to his people and God's ultimate judgment of evil. When we think about Christian view and we think about the teachings of humanity, the book shows the optimism of humankind as humans able to live in victory as they trust God. And so often in the Bible, we don't see that. We see a lot of failures, but in this particular book, we see how people do trust God and the rewards they gain from doing so. So teaching about salvation as Christians, the teaching of Rahab profoundly demonstrates grace through faith. She's thoroughly converted for her faithfulness, and she's considered an Israelite. She even becomes a biological ancestor of Jesus, and we'll find that in Joshua 6:25, Matthew 1, chapter 1 and verse 5, and then in Hebrews as well. And of course, this book is all about how the people were faithful, as you see scrolling across the bottom. So the first section, as we dive in, is the going over. And I'm going to move through this, fairly quickly because it really speaks for itself. Lots of information, but the first part, remember after Deuteronomy, Moses turns over the leadership to Joshua. So Joshua God prepares him in the first chapter, and there's a message from God to Joshua. Joshua prepares the people in the next section, and he tells them to take provisions. There's a request and a response from the eastern tribes, where you have Reuben, you have Gad, and you have the half of Manasseh opt to stay east of the promised land. And they were allowed to do that because they had agreed to and promised to help other tribes fight their portion for their portion of the land west of the Jordan if needed. So having been reminded of their agreement, Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh pledged their lives to Joshua because they had pledged their lives to Moses beforehand. So now they're pledging their lives to Joshua. So in chapter 2, we learn about the spies in Jericho and how Rahab saved them, who was a prostitute. Joshua sends out 2 spies. But something happened here. I don't know what's going on. Okay, stop. What's that? My thing came up. Shannon, I had to stop. I'm sorry. My screen jumped over. I think I got booted out. Hello? Am I still in?
I can hear you.
Good.
I don't know what happened. It just jumped. My mailbox came up.
No, I'm just kidding.
What's going on? I'm still on?
Yep.
Okay. I'm still sharing. I'm not sharing, right?
Correct.
Okay, let's see where we are. No. Okay, so we went through the going over. We have the spies and there's a prostitute, Rahab, that saves them. Joshua sends out 2 spies to look over the land, especially Jericho, and they meet Rahab. They spend the evening with her there. She kind of, looks out for them. Rahab extracts a promise from the spies saying that so that they will spare her family, and they agree. When the guards come looking because they hear that there are spies in the land, she hides them, and that's when she makes this agreement with them. And then after the guards leave, she sends them out. She helps them escape by letting them down through a window. And they tell her when she leaves, she tells them to stay in a certain area until a certain time, and they hang out there until a certain period, and then they are able to leave. But they tell her to put out a scarlet thread out her window when they come, and that way that'll save her family. So the spies return with a favorable report to Joshua, and the land is now ready to be possessed. So they go in chapter 3, crossing the Jordan, which kind of has that same kind of feel of Exodus, where the Jordan splits before them. The people prepare to march at the Jordan. God promises to help. Okay. And instructions are given, and the Ark of the Covenant is with them. The Ark of the Covenant, as we know, is very important. It's like God is there. God is before them, because this whole battle and all the things that Joshua and the Israelites experience, God is really in control. It's not their battle. It's what God is doing. He's like the leader of their army. So the priests move forward of the ark as a symbol of God's presence and leadership. The priests move forward the ark. I don't know why that's twice, but okay. The wonders of crossing the Jordan is what we see in chapter 3:14-17. When the feet of the priests have hit the waters are separated, like in Exodus. The people cross the dry, um, they cross over to the dry land, passing by the Ark of the Covenant. Then we move to chapter 4, there's a memorial for crossing the Jordan. We have representation from each tribe was taken with a stone and is memorialized for the event so that they could share with their descendants for the future. And I like how the Israelites, they always have a way of passing on information and always thinking about their future, which is very important. And I really wish a lot of us would do more of that. But at any rate, they are known for doing that, as we see here. When all the people have passed through, the priests were called out of the riverbed. As soon as their feet touched the land, the waters flowed again, just like we saw in Exodus. The name of the place is called Gilgad. Then we moved to chapter 5, and the kings of Canaan were totally disheartened when they heard what had happened. While in the camp of Gilgad, the people are circumcised, because remember, these people are not the people that went in to Mount Sinai with Moses. They are the descendants from everyone. All those people had died. So now these are their children who are now ready to fight, and they have another opportunity to start again and fulfill the promise because of their obedience. So they had to be circumcised. And so that's what happens here before they go in. So there's the celebration of the Passover and the end of manna. Remember when they didn't have food, manna was dropped down to them. So now that they're in the promised land, the manna stops. They have this feast, and after this very moment, there's no more manna. So the appearance of and also in this chapter, there's an appearance of a commander that suddenly arrives, and he tells Joshua to take off his shoes. And we know this scripture, for this place is sacred ground. This stranger that comes, Joshua doesn't know who he is, and he asks him, "Are you for us or against us?" And the stranger says neither. He's actually he's the leader of God's army. So that's when he asks him to take off his shoes. So if we go back up to the top, there's the invasion of the land and the taking over that happens. First, there's the fall of Jericho. We get the details of the battle, how the people will march around the city every 6 days. The people will march in silence, and the priests will blow their horn daily. They receive those directions. And then the instruction in conquest, only Rahab is to be spared. Nothing is to be taken under threat of Israel's destruction. That was very, very important, not to take anything. Very important. And again, the people have to be obedient. But that's a very, very important rule, not to take anything or when to take things. And so, and everybody in the tribe, every tribe had to be obedient to that rule. So then in the 20 through 25, Jericho is taken. On the 7th day, the people shout and the walls fall down. I always like this part because they say they had a war cry. And I always think of, what does a war cry sound like? And so all I can think of that song when it says, whoa. You know, when you see all those movies with the armies, and when they're ready to go in battle, you hear everybody shouting just which is always so interesting to me. But if that was a war cry, then that's what knocked the walls down. It was maybe a gift from God, definitely is what I agreed to. And Rahab and her family are saved, and the city is burned. In the rest of the chapter, it pronounces a curse on anyone who tries to rebuild this city. And then Joshua's reputation spreads. Everybody became afraid of him. So in the next section, we have another battle at Ai, which didn't work in the same favor. You have Achan, the tribe of Judah, who disobeyed the orders. He took forbidden, I don't know if that's the right word, I'm not even gonna say that word, but he took gold and silver from everything. He took possession of of jewels that he shouldn't have, and he hid them in his tent. And so he and his family, had to suffer behind that. So Joshua sent spies to report about over the confident. A few thousand men were sent and resoundingly defeated Israel, and was devastated. They got defeated because of Achan's because of Khan's, he took stuff that he wasn't supposed to, and God would like for us to be obedient, and they had to be obedient. And so since he didn't, in that battle, they lost. So they had come back and to try to figure out who did it. Every tribe had to line up, and this is all in the book, every tribe lined up and they did a process of elimination to see what everyone's lot was. And it came down to him and his family, and they were all stoned at the end. So I'm going to move down to after they were stoned in chapter 8. They ended up taking over the land. It was captured. The plan included an ambush. They were very clever at how they took over this land. They had some people in the front, and then they had some people stayed in the back. And when they went after them, the people from the land tried to get the people in the front. And when they did, the people in the back took over the land. And so when they realized what had happened, they turned around and they had lost because they took over. They had ambushed them as well. So all goes exactly as expected. Joshua builds an order at Mount Ebal. And the story changes from battle to worship. There's a treaty with the Gibeonites. Nations begin to band together against the Israelites, but the Gibeonites, they had decided to they tricked Israel. They tricked Joshua into making them think that they were not from that area. They were from somewhere far away, and they heard about them, and they wanted to form a treaty with them. And after they form this treaty with them, they find out that they're really around from the neighborhood. And so the people are very mad at them, but Joshua tells them that they had to honor the treaty and would not destroy them, because if they didn't honor it, it would give him a bad reputation. And so what they honored the treaty, but they made the Gibeonites serve as woodcutters and water carriers for the community. Very interesting story how that happened. So we get to chapter 10, and I'm not going to go through all 24 chapters like this. We're going to pause in a moment so I can show you what's really some things that's really going on here. The king of Gibeon runs to Joshua for the other kings in other lands. They joined together, and so they want to come after Joshua. They want to come after the Gibeonites, and so they run to Joshua for help. The consequences of not consulting the Lord before entering into treaties is what is the result of that, was why they're there. Joshua now consults the Lord and is told to fight. So in chapter 10, we go to a poem from the book of Jasper. There's memories of divine action, include hail and the sun stood still. If you remember that story about the day the sun stood still, this is where that comes from. And the battle is won because the sun stood still and they were able to attack these other nations and won. There's the cleaning up in the south. And then Joshua took all these kings in their land at one time because the Lord of God of Israel fought for Israel. The completion of in chapter 11, there's the completion of the conquest. On the seventh day, the people shout in the walls. Seems like there's something wrong. Okay, something happened that this skipped back to so there's a summary of victories. I'm going to skip to there. There's a summary of victories, and then there's a list of defeated kings, 31 in all, the list of all the victories, and they give praise to God. All right, so next chapter is the vision of the lands, which there's a lot that happens there. I'm going to pause here and I want to show you a presentation on what's going on in this book, because the dividing of the land is pretty much, it as all the land is divided amongst the people. As you can see here, here's how the land was divided in that section. Seems like it got a little lost somewhere and there's a slide missing, but this presentation will pull it all together for you. So here we go.
The book of Joshua. Let's back up and remember the story so far. So God chose Abraham, and then his family became the people of Israel, who are then enslaved down in Egypt. And so through Moses, God rescued Israel out of Egypt. He made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai, and he brought them through the wilderness. So Israel then camped outside the promised land, and Moses called them to obey God's commands so that they could show all the other nations what God is like. The book of Joshua picks up right after Moses has died and Israel's ready to enter the land. So the story of Joshua is designed with four main movements. Joshua first leads Israel into the promised land, and then once they're there, they meet all this hostility from the Canaanites, and so they engage them in battle. Then after their victories, Joshua divides up the promised land as the inheritance for the 12 tribes, and then the book concludes with these final speeches that Joshua gives to the people. So let's dive in and we'll see how all of it flows together. The first section begins with Moses' death, and Joshua is appointed as Israel's new leader. And the author intentionally presents Joshua as a new Moses. So like Moses, Joshua calls the people to obey the Torah, which means the covenant commands that they were given at Mount Sinai. And then Joshua sends spies into the land, just as Moses did back in Numbers chapters 13 and 14, except it goes way better this time. In fact, even some Canaanites turn and follow the God of Israel. Joshua then leads all Israel across the Jordan River and into the land. Just like the sea parted for Moses in the Exodus, so here the River Jordan parts and the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant across, leading all Israel with them. Now, in chapter 5, the story transitions. So the people look back to their roots as God's covenant people. And so the new generation is circumcised and they celebrate their first Passover in the land. But then they turn and prepare to go forward. And Joshua has this crazy encounter with a mysterious warrior who, it turns out, is the angelic commander of God's army. And Joshua asks, "Are you for us or are you for our enemies?" And the warrior responds, "Neither." Which shows that the real question here is whether Joshua is on God's side. It makes clear that this whole story is not about Israel versus the Canaanites. Rather, this is God's battle, and Israel is going to play the role of spectators or sometimes supporters in God's plan, which leads to the next section. We find stories about all these conflicts that Israel had with different Canaanite groups. And the first part retells the story of two battles in detail, and that's followed by a series of short stories that condense years of battles into a few brief summaries. So the first two battles are against Jericho and then Ai, and they offer these contrasting portraits of God's faithfulness versus Israel's failure. At Jericho, Israel is to take a completely passive approach. So they let God's presence in the ark lead them around the city to music for 6 days. And just like Rahab turned to the God of Israel, maybe the people of Jericho would do the same, but they don't. And so on the seventh day, the priests blow the trumpets and the walls come falling down, leading Israel to victory. The point of the story is that God is the one who will deliver his people. Israel simply needs to trust and wait. Now, the next story of the battle at Ai makes the opposite point. So there's this Israelite named Achan, and he steals from Jericho some of the devoted goods that were to belong to God alone, and then he lies about it. It's a pretty lame move after all that God has done for Israel. And so Israel goes into battle with the city of Ai, and they're totally defeated. And it's only after humble repentance and severely dealing with Achan's sin that Israel gains victory. And so together, these two stories, they're placed right up front to make an important point. If Israel is going to inherit the land, they have to be obedient and trust in God's commands. They don't get special treatment. Now, the second part of this section begins with the Gibeonites, a Canaanite people group, and they do just what Rahab did as they turn to follow the God of Israel and they make peace with Israel. This is in contrast to all of these other Canaanite kings who start to form alliances and coalitions, and they want to destroy Israel. So Israel engages them in battle, and they win by a landslide. And so this whole section concludes with this summary list of all of these victories won by Moses and then by Joshua. Now, let's stop for a second, because odds are that these stories and the violence in them, they're going to bother you. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you're bound to wonder, like, didn't Jesus say to love your enemies? Why is God declaring war here? So first, why the Canaanites? The main reasons are actually given earlier in the biblical story. It's that the culture of the Canaanites had become extremely morally corrupt, especially when it comes to sex. Go check out Leviticus chapter 18. And they also widely practiced child sacrifice. Go see Deuteronomy chapter 12. And so God didn't want these practices to influence Israel. The Canaanites had to go. Which raises the second question. Did God actually command the destruction of all the Canaanites, like a genocide? So at first glance, you look at the phrases used in these stories. They totally destroyed them. They left no survivor or anything that breathed. But when you look a second time more closely, you'll see that these phrases are clearly hyperbole and not literal. So go back to the original command about the Canaanites in Deuteronomy chapter 7. Israel is first told to drive out the Canaanites, but then to totally destroy them. And then that's followed by commands to not intermarry with them or enter into business deals with them. So you can't marry someone that you've destroyed. I think you get the point. The same idea applies to the stories in Joshua. Look closely. So for example, we're told in Joshua chapter 10 that Israel left no survivors in the cities of Hebron or Debir. But then later in chapter 15, we see these towns and they're still populated by Canaanites. And so what we're seeing is that Joshua fits in with other ancient battle accounts by using non-literal hyperbolic language as part of the narrative style. And so the word genocide doesn't actually fit what we see here, especially in light of the stories about the Canaanites who did turn to the God of Israel, like Rahab or the Gibeonites. God was open to those who would turn to him. The last thing to think about is that these stories mark a unique moment in Israel's history. These battles were limited to the handful of people groups living in the land of Canaan. With all other nations, Israel was commanded by God to pursue peace. Go read Deuteronomy chapter 20. So the purpose of these battle stories was never to tell you, the reader, to go commit violence in God's name. Rather, they show God bringing his justice on human evil at a unique moment in history and how he delivered Israel from being annihilated by the Canaanites. Now, let's go back to the book's design. After years of battles, we see an aging Joshua, and he starts dividing up the land for the 12 tribes of Israel. And most of this section is like lists of boundary lines. And let's be honest, it's kind of boring. It's like reading a map that has no pictures. But for the Israelites, these lists were super important. This was the fulfillment of God's ancient promises to Abraham that his descendants would inherit the promised land. And so now it was all coming to pass right down to the detail, which leads to the final section. Joshua gives two speeches to the people that are very similar to the final speeches of Moses in Deuteronomy. Joshua reminds them of God's generosity, how he brought them into the land and rescued them from the Canaanites. And so he calls them to turn away from the Canaanite gods and be faithful to the covenant they made. If they do, it will lead to life and blessing in the land. But if they're unfaithful, Israel will call down on itself the same divine judgment that the Canaanites experienced. They'll be kicked off the land into exile. And so Joshua leaves Israel with a choice. What is Israel going to do? That's the big question that looms as the story ends, and that's the book of Joshua.
All righty. Let's go back. So yes, I like these presentations, as you guys know, that have been with us at the church, because they spell it out in a different way. And it allows, some of us that need different modes of digesting and engaging in the material, it gives you a chance to hear it, see the graphics of how he draws it all out, and then you become connected to it. As a teacher, I know my students all have different modes of learning. So in this platform, I was telling Shannon, it's so hard for me to sit and just talk, blah, 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 blah. And I said the last time that I was going to learn how to use this technology a little better, so that the next time that I taught Bible study, I'd be able to share some things, with you without me sitting here talking the whole time. And so he did a lot for me, and also gave you imagery to look at, and also put yourself in the story as well. So yes, so we got to the end of the book, but when we stopped at the vision of the land, which he talked about. So I'm going to go forward on that. I'm going to page 11. I'm not going to give you numbers because I'm going to go to chapter 20, which is one of the points I really like in this story, because if you remember the tribe of Levi, the Levites, they were the priests in Mount Sinai. They were the priests that were appointed by God at the time. Their whole tribe, they took over the being a priest. So, but in Joshua, they are assigned. They didn't get assigned land, but they were assigned cities within the land, and these cities were cities of refuge for people who had committed crimes, and they were accused, but not they were really innocent from doing them. So they would go to these city gates, and they would explain their charge and what had happened to them. And if the priests would let them in, the Levites, if they would let them in, they would have an asylum for them. And anybody that came looking for them was not able to come in and punish them. Now, coming in did not mean you escaped your crime that you were accused of. It just meant that you had to be on trial with the Levites, and then they would determine your outcome. So they were given cities within the land as an asylum for those people that had that problem. So I thought that was very, that shows a side of God that leaves space. There's a space for grace where people can have their crimes solved in a way that, people just wouldn't kill them just because of how they felt without hearing their story. So I like that portion in the book of Joshua where it talks about that. As we went into the next chapter in 22, when he talked about the last days of Joshua, right when at some point the tribe of Manasseh, Reuben, and Gad, they had decided that they would have land on the other side. They were going to stay on the east side of the Jordan. So when they decided to go to the east side when they didn't want to go back, they decided to build an altar. And so this altar, having an altar was so important in biblical times. We know that in the tent, the altar had the fire burning at all times, and it was like the presence of God was there. The light could not be burnt out. People gave sacrifices at the altar. They gave gifts. All these things happened at the altar. So when they decided that when they got to crossing over to the east side and they were going to build an altar, the other tribes got so upset. They couldn't understand why they were building this altar and going against God. And, they were, and this is all in the book, all in the chapter, they tell you how they were ready to like take them out because of what had happened before, and they had lost the battle. So they couldn't believe that as far as they have come, why would they now do something against God? Because God had been good to all of them. And so if any of them did anything wrong, they would all have to suffer. And so they came before they went into battle against them for building this altar, they went and sent the priest to go talk to them. And in their conversation, they had explained to them that it was not because they were going against God that they were building this altar. They were building this altar because they wanted their descendants and the other tribes' descendants to know that they too were a part of this body, this divine body, and that they too could worship God too, because they were going to the other side of the Jordan. They didn't want to feel like they were going to be left out. And as time went on, they didn't want their children to feel isolated and to be shunned away like they weren't. So they wanted to put this altar there as a symbol of who they were, and that they are a part of the community. They are still able to worship. And when their children and their children and their children, grow, whenever they get to that moment, that altar, they will remember that they too are a part of the body of God, that they too are they were part of the promised land too, and they should also be able to worship. So they didn't want to feel separate. So once they realized that they were building this altar for something good, they created it out of a wall, and they called it witness, because it was a witness of who they were and who they would be to their children. And so I thought that was a really very important moment, again, of them passing history down to their kids and still making sure that everybody is still a part of the blessing, and that they wouldn't be separate. Because you could easily see that if we went to the other side, not knowing who your relatives are from the other side, it's kind of interesting how the distance that grows between you. And so they wanted to make sure that they weren't going to become distant, but they were going to still be a part of the history and be a part of the blessing. So I thought that was a good story to read, even though there was going to be another battle over it, but it was prevented. So thank goodness for that. The other things that I found in this chapter, there's a final word in here that says, principle to live by. From Joshua, we learn to follow God fully throughout our time on earth. We must keep our eye on God and our focus on Christ, on Jesus Christ. As we see with the people of Israel in this chapter, their focus was they trusted God in their process. When they didn't, they saw what, the thing that happened, with Achan, and that was the only thing. They used that as an example, but their faithfulness helped them to win land after land after land after land after land after land after land, till they took over the whole land, and to God's glory, because they trusted him. And it shows that we can trust, we can trust. And sometimes even when it seems impossible, even like times like now, when it seems so impossible, and your faith is, when you're looking at what's in front of you, if you choose to trust God, I certainly believe that in the end, he'll come through. That's how I see it. And that's why, like I shared that dance, we are trusting God to pull us through. So we see that in this story. And I think this is a great story in the midst of what we're going through now, how their faithfulness allowed them to receive the blessing. And then Joshua, he dies. And at the end, they also share with you where some of the other people from the tribe die, and they give their funeral grounds and burials of where they are. And so it's just a really great story to there's so much more in here. Two other promises we find in here, and I think the presentation said that was that Abraham, God had promised Abraham the land, they got it, and then he had also promised to judge the Canaanites, and we see that happen here. Now, as you see, some of the Canaanites were still a part of the community. Joshua in his last, the people had agreed to still trust God. They agreed in this covenant to still do that. And Joshua had reminded them, and I want to say to God, not to talk and listen and worship their gods, don't call out their names, don't do all these things that change who they are. And I guess you'll find out if that really went so well as you study the next part of this series. Next week, you're going to be studying Acts. But in this series, we end with Joshua. So next week you go into Acts, and then we'll come back to the Old Testament. But I really think this is a great story to share. I'm going to take this off of share, stop sharing now. So what do you think about the book of Joshua?
Anybody got any questions?
I say it's a war manual.
Yeah.
Huh? Yeah, it's a war manual.
I say it shows God's faithfulness and our responsibility to follow his word. Don't follow his word, we see what happens.
Has
Oh,
the
yeah.
news on or
That's
radio
today.
behind?
That's
Would you
today when you're disobedient.
please turn the news radio or whatever you got going on behind you, please? Thank you. Go ahead, whoever was talking.
To answer your question, Sean, I truly don't know because she doesn't share everything.
Anybody else, any comments?
Yo, there's a lot going on.
There's a lot going on in the background. I see people on the phone.
Honest to goodness, I can't hear.
I'm gonna mute everybody again.
Yes.
If you have a comment, you can unmute.
Oh, let me.
So wait a minute, Reverend Crystal. All right, Reverend Crystal is open. And if you have a comment or question, you can unmute or raise your hand or do something where I can see you to unmute you if you can't unmute yourself. Or you can, all right, Sister Gail. Hold on a second. 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 All right, there you go.
I'm
Sister
muted.
Gail. Sister Gail.
Yeah, I said before that one of the things the chapter shows us, to me, the most important one is how when we're faithful to what God tells us to do, how we're blessed. And when we don't listen, then what happens to us? We have a very hard time dealing with it. So it reminded me of like, even of these times when we're going through stuff and we have to trust him and be faithful to him and do what he tells us to do, how he tells us to do it.
I agree. I totally agree. I think them as a body of, I want to say of Christ, but Christ wasn't alive at them. As the body of God, as children of God, they bound together to trust, and all of them had to trust. Not just, it's like, you know how they say, no one gets left behind. I guess that's from Moana, one of those children's movies where they keep everybody involved. But here, everybody had to do what's right. And in their faithfulness, God had fulfilled his promise. And what a promise he fulfilled, because look how much land they gained. And remember, the land was filled with people, before they got there. There's scripture that talks about they didn't grow that land. They didn't do anything. They just were given that land, not because of the work they did to develop it, but because of their faithfulness to God. And so that's a lot what we get today. Sometimes it's not about, when they say favor is not fair, because you might be faithful and God sees that and he gives you something that maybe you didn't work to get, but he knows you might, excel or need that. So they had favor with God, and their faithfulness gained them that favor, because again, that land, all those lands were already preoccupied with people, and the people that sided with them, because the other promise was that the other thing that was said was that even non-Israelites would begin to believe in God. And so we see Rahab, we see how she began to believe. The Gibeonites, they began to believe, because if they didn't, they wouldn't have said, hey, we need to follow you guys. How can we get protection? So they had to trick them in order to get protection, and it might not have been such a great way to do it, but at least it shows that they began to believe and support, what they were doing, and they wanted to still survive. But again, I guess we'll see how long their faithfulness lasted as we learn more about, the other books that are part of this series. Yes. Any other comments? Or
Stanley Roberts, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, hi, very good, Reverend Crystal. I have a question. Is it in the book of Joshua when he said, as for me and my house, we will bless the Lord? And I remember Pastor told us something about it because I think I was using it out of context. Do you remember how he?
I believe that is in there. I believe in my listening of the.
Joshua 24.
Yes, that is in there. I mean, there's so much in this book. It's just so much. When I'm when I prep for Bible study, I read and I also listen to it read to me. And like some of the things that come out when I listen to this, I was like, wow, this is also interesting. Like, you don't get this much when you do the outline, but when you read it, so I advise all of you to go back and really read the book. It's an easy read because you could get through all 24 chapters, easily, because it's very interesting. It's a nice narrative about how the people moved to the promised land. After you get through all the battles, you've gotten somewhere. But and then the dividing of the land, because remember again, the Levites, they didn't get land, and the tribe of Manasseh, they were divided into two parts. Some of them were on the west, and the other half stayed on the east. So it's really, very interesting. And there's a lot of going back and things that resemble from other books, like the splitting of the Jordan. Joshua was actually one of the spies for Moses. I mean, there's so much that you could remember from the other books, like, hey, did I read this in here? I thought that was in another book. But it's just a retelling of the story, and you can begin to see how they're all connected, and how, things didn't just happen once. And like today, things don't just, we're not the only one that experienced that. But it's just there's a lot of stuff in there to unpack and to really focus in that one moment on that one passage. Like, wow, that's very, interesting. How Joshua stood and had to take off his sandals. You're standing on sacred ground. Some stranger who became the leader of the army, who came to talk to him about the plan to take over all these lands. And he was faithful. And again, remember in the beginning, I said he was one of the only biblical characters in the Old Testament that we see as sinless, and flawless. So people say that he resembled Christ and he was preparing us for Christ. So yes, you should take the time to really go back and read the story.
I would add to that, Reverend Crystal, that much of the Bible, as I've been saying for going on 2 years now, much of it challenges any reality TV show you've ever seen. I mean, there's just so much going on in the Bible that it really is a story of humanity. And what I love about Joshua, and kind of what I love even about the people of the nation of Israel, what we should take heart in is that just because they're in the Bible don't make them no better people than us. I mean, they was just people. I mean, they were just from the hood straight up. And
look at how their family structure is.
Right. They were just from the hood. And what you're gonna find in that last part of Joshua, which is, I mean, I just love there's so much preaching material in Joshua. Joshua calls everybody before him and retells the whole story. He says, it's how y'all got here. All right. This is all the stuff you went through. All right. Jehovah God is not the only God you can choose. All right. But choose, I want you to make a choice, he says, whom you're going to serve.
That's where it is. Yes.
The God's over there or the God's over here. He says, but listen, but as for me and my house, that's Joshua 24, he says, we will serve the Lord, right? The people say, yeah. They say, we too. That's in the text. We too will serve the Lord, right? So Joshua dies peacefully, thinking that all of the people are going to serve the Lord. But as soon as Joshua died, right, the folk forgot all about what they agreed to do. So they just people from the hood. All right. We are situational. Right now, everybody's got an ear and an eye for the significance of spirituality
Yeah.
because of what we've been going through.
Mhm.
9/11, I'll never forget. I was pastoring in Harlem. 9/11, couldn't get in the church. Had to put chairs in the aisle. Folk was just twisted out because of 9/11. But as we got past it, right, and things got back to normal, folk forgot all about the spiritual connection and the need they had when they was going through. And the same thing gonna happen this time. I mean, I'm not a pessimist, but once we kind of get back into a new what becomes a new regular groove, folk gonna forget, you know, what we've been through and what we're going through. And you know, I keep telling folk, y'all call on the prayer line morning and night, and you may just be able to do it now because your time is different. But our presence on the prayer line every day has tripled. We have 100. One night we had 115 people on the prayer line, right? There ain't been a day in the last 2 months that we had less than 85 people on the prayer line. All right, because we all praying now, but wait till we start getting back into the groove. All right, getting back our schedules. You know, getting back stuff the way we used to be. And it's going to be very interesting to see how we manage that. So Joshua is a phenomenal book. Phenomenal book. Anybody else got questions? Questions, anybody? You can unmute yourselves if you have a question. All right. So let's thank Reverend Crystal for a wonderful.
I had a question.
Wonderful. You got a question, Sister Terry?
Yeah, I had a question. The warrior that came down and said he was for nobody, was he really, he was an angel, correct?
From God. He was
from God.
Messenger from God.
A messenger.
He was the leader of God's army, is what it says. He was the leader of God's army. He says neither, because again, it was to prepare Joshua for he was going for it, and it let Joshua know he wasn't in charge. No, he was. God was in charge, and God sent him to give him the plan and to go forward with the plan, and he was going for it. And that's
so we never know what his name is.
It doesn't say. It says a stranger is what.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to know whether he was an angel from the God. Yeah. Okay.
It's revealed that he was.
Okay. Thank you, Christy. You did a great job.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Questions, comments?
No, great job.
Yeah.
Right. So as I was starting to do a minute ago, come on, let's get Reverend Crystal a hallelujah. All right.
You guys see, I'm trying to make it engaging. Last time I was here, I was like blah 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 blah. So I got my little virtual background, had my little presentation trying to get it. I think I messed up one of the slides, but I'm just like, I just want to engage everyone to be into it with me and not me just talking to you, because I know it's easy to start doing other stuff while you listening. So I hope it's engaging for everyone. I appreciate
that was
your focus and time.
Good Bible study, good preparation.
Very much so.
Good presentation, and you kept everybody's attention and engaging, and we thank God for you and for all that you did tonight and all that you do in the ministry of the church. Let me remind everybody that we're alternating in our study. So as Reverend Crystal said, next week we'll go into the book of Acts, and then we'll come back the following week and do Judges. We will be, I'm real clear that we'll be doing this at minimum another month, at minimum another month.
Not probably two.
And probably two, the way I'm looking at it, but at minimum another month. So we'll get through. Those of you who want to join us for the membership class Saturday, make sure you go on, click on the link and register for the class. We are at 1:30 Saturday for the starting our membership class. Don't forget Bible study tonight, and please pass the word to your young people, to all of our young people, that we are on at 5 o'clock tomorrow night If you have not checked your email, I sent an updated list of links and passwords, and I have identified the new links that I added to the sheet. You
Yeah.
have to take a look at it. I can't do that for you. All right. Please take a look at it and please govern yourselves accordingly. You can share the links and the passwords with trusted people that you know. And also I'm going to send out an email in a minute to announce the passing of Brother Derek Nobles, who I understand is a former member of St. Matthew.
Yeah.
And I'll send that information out very, very shortly. So we are, we're in the middle of it, and just keep persons and families and others in prayer. Reverend Crystal, pray us out, please.
May we bow our heads and close our eyes. Most gracious God, we just thank you for another opportunity to just learn your word, oh God. We want to know just as much about you as we can. We know that you are the protector, the guider, the way maker in our lives. So we want to be close to you, God. So we take this time to come together and learn all about you and your ways. And we just thank you for being able to do that, even in such times. Thank you for allowing us to meet in this moment, in this platform, to learn all about you for your honor and your glory. We ask you to keep us safe, keep us humble, keep our families together, allow us to continue to grow in faith and hold on to your loving ways, oh God. Through Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen, amen. God bless you. Love you all.